and welcome back. Today we're going to talk a little bit about food and drug safety. So we all eat food, so that's a concern for all of us. And then a huge proportion of the US population uses medications of various sorts. And in fact, many of us use multiple medications. So ensuring that food and drugs are safe for us is a major consideration for public health practice. So one of the main inspirations for starting to think about food safety is the publication of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. So quality of food has always been a challenge for world populations. You know, having rotten food or food that has communicable diseases in them our foodborne diseases are actually a major risk for health and remain a major risk for health around the globe. Now, in the early 1900s, Upton Sinclair published a book called The Jungle, which was about the process for meat production of meat in these meat packaging plants. And what he essentially did is he showed the public about essentially how this is done. And the truth is that it was truly disgusting. So you would have these meat packing plants, which often had cracks in the roofs so that you had rain coming in and falling on the meat, mold all over the place. You would have rats running all over the place, getting mixed in with the meats, feces everywhere. And food that was entirely rotten would just get mixed into the sausage, for example. So it was actually a really truly disgusting process. And at that time, foodborne illnesses were a major health concern in the United States. So fortunately, that actually helped inspire change in the creation of the FDA. Now, another thing that was happening during that time was also essentially quackery around the use of drugs. So essentially, anyone could come up with any sort of medication and peddle it around. This is often called snake oil cures, and these are cures that essentially had no evidence that they were helpful, typically. And some of them might have had some beneficial health effects, but many of them were actually probably quite poisonous. And there were cases of situations where these types of cures actually did have cause death for a large number of people. So these were considerations around the safety of these snake oil cures were a major concern at the time. So in 1906, the FDA was created, and that was really, again, came out of the muckraking response to food and food production through The Jungle and other journalistic efforts, and the public outcry that came after that. So what this did essentially required that companies accurately label what the ingredients of their food were. But unfortunately, this only required that it left the burden on the FDA to actually say when something was actually a problem. So to remove something from the market, they had to go and proactively address that situation. In 1938, we see that there's sort of an expansion to what the FDA did. So this, for example, required that you actually have safety testing before you use a new drug. And this came out of the use of sulfa, where there's a medication that actually caused massive kidney damage and killed about 100 people because it had an antifreeze related substance in it. And that was really dangerous. So this prompted the requirement that companies have to show that their medication doesn't cause harm. Then we also see progression in terms of requiring that companies actually show that their medications actually produce benefits. So this is an example of thalidomide, where this came from the thalidomide situation where it caused a huge range of different birth defects. Fortunately, this didn't happen in the United States because we had protections and regulations in place. And actually, it's one specific regulator who really blocked this from happening, which we can all be grateful for. But in Europe, this had a much bigger impact. So from that disaster came this requirement that we want to make sure that we're not exposing people to risk for medications that actually don't have benefits. There's also in some cases, some retraction of power. Previously, the FDA recommended required that companies did not actually advertise their products. Now we actually find that the Supreme Court ruled that companies could actually market their drugs directly to the public. So some changes there as well. So when we think about the health impact of food, we've already addressed some of the ideas around the fact that here in the United States, one of our major challenges is overnutrition. So high caloric content of our foods leads to various different diseases, conditions related to increased body weight and diabetes and other factors related to this. So this can actually be a substantial risk factor here in the United States. Although that isn't to say that certain groups actually have decreased access to food. So it is still a consideration. So globally, though, we also want to consider the fact that there is still rampant starvation in many parts of the world. And this is a real ethical failing on our part because there is enough food in the globe. It's just that we're not actually distributing that food to people who need it. So so a real public health challenge to consider there. Another type of deficiency from not having enough food or not having the right distribution of food is not having enough vitamins and minerals in your food. So having a variety of food in your diet that can provide these things. And this is a major concern, particularly across socioeconomic groups in the United States. So there's been many examples of this. One of the early ones is pellagra, where they did research. They were trying to figure out why this disease was happening, with fairly substantial and often lethal effects in the U.S. population. And they originally thought that it was some sort of infectious condition, but it actually turned out that it was due to vitamins. And they found that by seeing that there was a socioeconomic relationship going on, that people who had less varied diets were the ones who were likely to get this. And is nicotinamide that was actually the factor, vitamin B3. And by narrowing it down, they found that if we include this in the diet, it will be helpful. And sometimes what we do in public health is we ensure that there's supplementation of food to make sure that people are getting access to these vitamin and minerals. Another concern is contaminants. So aflatoxin, which is a fungus that enters food, that's a thing that people respond to. That's in a lot of foods, and it's very hard to get rid of. And in fact, that isn't actually seen as being really possible at this point. So we have thresholds over for these aflatoxins over which foods can contain. We also have things like contaminants like rat feces. So we actually have guidelines nationally about how much rat feces there's allowed to be in our wheats and other types of grains, for example, because they do enter our foods. So so there are things like contaminants that we would consider and be concerned about. Then we also have things like individual susceptibilities. So we all probably know people who have nut allergies, for example, or certain genetic traits that influence how they respond to food. So these things are also considerations in terms of our food systems and health impacts. And then we have foodborne communicable diseases. So these are a major concern as well. Historically, it was a real issue because we didn't have systems in place to ensure food safety, but we've actually improved a lot in that respect. So as I mentioned, this is still a major concern. So they estimate that about 1 in 6 Americans get sick per year. That adds up to about 48 million people. So many of us have various different GI health effects from food that we've eaten, and we know that they're not pleasant. But it also leads to about 120,000 hospitalizations per year. So that's a really big impact in terms of morbidity. And while mortality isn't high, it's high enough that it's still a major consideration in terms of public health. Now, what we do know from these health effects from diseases is that the very young and the elderly and people who have compromised immune systems are most vulnerable to these health effects. So there's a lot of there's over 250 different foodborne illnesses that we know of at this point. Some common ones are salmonella, a major concern, very often transmitted through eggs, but it has a fairly high rate of hospitalization due to it. Norovirus, a very contagious form of foodborne illness. You can catch it directly from people, but very often you get it from sharing food, or it can be on surfaces. So has a major and fairly unpleasant health impacts. Campylobacter, another major disease that has a range of different health effects and a lot of hospitalization. Toxoplasma, it's actually causes the most deaths across different foodborne illnesses. It's also very common. They estimate that maybe 60 million Americans have it in their bodies, but our immune system normally takes care of it. But when you have that as an actual infection that can come out, pregnant women, other vulnerable groups can have this happen, it's actually very lethal. So the most deaths there. And then E. coli, certain strains of E. coli are very dangerous, where they produce toxins that can be incredibly lethal. So there are a lot of different foodborne illnesses out there that we do still struggle with, and we get in our food system, and we need to monitor them to make sure that we're not having outbreaks of these foodborne illnesses. So how do we deal with these outbreaks of foodborne illnesses? Well, first is we have to monitor our food systems to make sure our health, to see if these outbreaks might be happening in different regions. And when you have an outbreak of health impacts, well, you need to figure out what's causing it, right? You need to start creating some hypotheses about why this might be happening. And in some cases, you can base those hypotheses off of the symptoms of the disease, because we know that different types of foodborne illnesses have some symptoms, but there are a lot of overlap between them. So you go through a process of testing those hypotheses, doing laboratory testing, for example, to see if they're causing something. So if you don't find associations, and if you have continuing health impacts, well, then you have to go through that process to continue to try and find them. If you do find associations, then what you really want to do is start thinking about what are the point of contamination. If we're going back to the same point of contamination, we can just keep reinfecting people. So you really want to figure out what that cause is, whether it's coming from a certain farm or coming from a certain product in the food system. And then you want to do something to control that outbreak. For example, having a recall of those products, or remove the source of contamination if it's happening at a farm. For example, maybe sewage is actually entering into a farm, which often happens from farm animals near a farm. And sometimes that can lead us to improving our systems so that we can prevent this in the future. And then we hopefully find a resolution to this health-related outbreak. So when we think about dealing with these outbreaks, we have systems in place. There's a collaboration between the CDC, FDA, and USDA to look at this, called the Foodborne Disease Active Surveillance Network, or FoodNet. So it's really in charge of investigating these different foodborne outbreaks to understand them, and is involved in monitoring and looking at these different factors, trying to attribute it to different causes, and also is responsible for disseminating information about these outbreaks. And we also have the Food Safety Modernization Act in 2010, which actually helped us with being able to track these foodborne diseases by ensuring, for example, that farmers say that you can track where different foods are coming from, for example. So having systems in place so that we can monitor and track where these foodborne illnesses might be coming from. So in terms of our food security, when we think about food security, that's ensuring that people have access to food. So as I mentioned, we do have a problem with overnutrition in the United States, but sometimes that overnutrition, sometimes we have overnutrition of foods that don't have a wide range of nutrients, right? So lower SES communities, for example, have a lot of diseases that are associated with lack of vitamins and minerals, or the types of nutrients that you get from fresh fruits and vegetables, for example. And then sometimes you can have risks related to not having enough food as well. So in terms of our population, food security programs actually cover about 15% of the U.S. population, particularly low-income groups. But we have two major programs through the USDA. One is SNAP, it's a Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and this used to be called food stamps. But this helps support people in terms of getting good food and enough food to support them. There's also the Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children. And you should know about this program because low-income folks who are pregnant can actually get, or have children, can get additional resources. And we know that good nutrition early on in life is tremendously important for long-term health impacts. So that's part of why this program exists. It's a very important, successful program for people who need to support their children. So something that you should be aware of as someone going into health-related fields. In terms of the agencies that oversee this, well, we have multiple parts to thinking about food and food systems. One is the FDA, which has overall responsibility for safety regulation for foods in the U.S. We have the USDA, which really thinks about agriculture and production of meats, poultry, and eggs. Then we have the EPA. So the EPA has a lot of roles in terms of thinking about pesticides and other chemical use, water quality conditions. So they are involved in those types of considerations. And the CDC also is involved in these types of things in terms of monitoring and surveilling to see if we are potentially having outbreaks of foodborne illness. Now, at the global level, we also have organizations that are very involved. So the FAO is a UN-based agency that looks at overall food supply and looks at undernutrition at a global level. And the WHO also is really concerned about this and ensuring that you have an adequate food supply, and the safety of that food supply is also a concern that they consider. The CIC is a joint program between the FAO and WHO that looks at things like guidelines, codes, and other structures for ensuring that we have an adequate supply of food and we have a safe supply of food. All right, so let's switch gears and talk a little bit about drug safety, a very important consideration in the United States. It's an important consideration because we use a lot of drugs. So medications make up about over 10% of our overall U.S. healthcare expenditure. So it's something that we invest a lot in as a society. About 75% of physician visits actually involve some sort of drug therapy in that process. So it's used very frequently in medical practice. If you look at how many people are actually using medications of various sorts, you find that about 50% of people have used a prescription drug in the past 30 days. And then many people actually are using more than one prescription drug. So about 23% of the population is using 3 or more drugs within the past 30 days. And so there's a lot of use of medications of various sorts. There's about 3 billion prescriptions per year in the United States. So a lot of use of medications. Some of those commons that you see are analgesics, so pain relief, antihyperlipidemic agents of various sorts. So those are drugs dealing with fats, lipids in the blood to decrease that and the risk for heart disease. And then the antidepressants, because that's, again, one of the more common mental illnesses and challenges in the United States as well. So when it comes to drug safety, if you have this many medications, not all medications have no impact. So we know that a lot of medications have side effects of various sorts. So In a perfect world, all medications would only deal with the disease that they're targeting. But when you have impacts on biological systems, you often have other side effects that may be negative. And we know that some people respond much more negatively to those side effects. So we find that about 100,000 Americans per year die of the adverse side effects of drugs. And those are actually for correctly prescribed medications. So we know that this is a major health impact in the United States. So we also know that some of these health impacts can be actually quite severe. So a case study for this is the drug Vioxx, which came out in recent years. Vioxx was a very common medication used for arthritis and chronic pain, where we found that there were about 80 million prescriptions worldwide. It turned out that Merck, the company that produced this drug, actually knew about that this drug increased risk for heart attacks and stroke about 5 years before this actually came to light. So for those 5 years, they were selling a whole lot of medications. And during that time, they estimate that there was an additional 88 to 140,000 cases of serious heart disease as a result of use of this medication. So having good systems in place for looking at these drugs and ensuring that you have high quality drug safety is a real concern when we think about public health impacts. So you should know a little bit about how drugs are developed. There is a process by which we look at drugs as they're in a preclinical phase to try and see. First off, you have the laboratory phase where they're developing different types of chemicals that might be of interest, and we have a clinical phase where they look, for example, at animals to see whether or not the drugs might have health benefits. Then we have phase 1 studies, and this is really initial studies to see whether medications might have some sort of benefit or not. Well, actually not benefit. They're specifically looking to see whether or not they medications that have some sort of promise or are of some sort of interest are potentially safe. So additionally looking at possible doses to figure out how much of a medication you need to give to even get someone in a therapeutic range where it might have an impact, and seeing whether it might have potential negative impacts on sensitive organs, for example. Okay, so that's phase 1. Usually these are fairly small studies with only a few people. Then we have phase 2, and this is a larger safety study. So looking to see whether or not there are possibly important side effects. These are larger studies, 100 to 300 roughly. And you might get some indication of whether this might have some health benefits as well from these studies. Starting to look at possibilities of efficacy. Then in phase 3, we're looking at moving on to larger trials with perhaps thousands of people. And that's where you begin to actually see greater evidence of actual effectiveness in the real world. And you also would see some of these rarer side effects that might pop up from health impacts of this drug in terms of adverse effects. Once it goes to phase 3 to phase 4, we have approval of the medication. At phase 4, it's actually being used in society. And here we're trying to monitor these drugs long term to see if there's side effects once it's used in the general population. So when we look at drugs and drug development, we look at thousands and thousands of different chemicals in the drug discovery and preclinical phases. And this can actually take quite a long period of time to look at these different drugs to see whether or not they might even have potential benefits in health-related considerations. As we're moving into clinical trials, for every 5,000 compounds that you might have started out with, 5 to 10,000 compounds you might have started out, you might only be looking at roughly 5 different medications, different pharmaceuticals. Now, as you move forward from there, you're only looking at a handful of different pharmaceuticals in phase 2 and phase 3 trials. And then you might get one that actually goes through to be an FDA approved drug. So This whole process actually takes a long time. It takes about 10 to 15 years to move a drug through that, a chemical through that whole process to ultimately have an approved medication. It's also a very expensive process, $100 million to $1 billion per drug that you go through. And again, that's because many chemicals fail for every one that actually gets approved as a drug. Now, the pharmaceutical industry is a huge industry. It's over $400 billion per year in terms of profits for that industry. But it still is a major burden to an expense to go through this whole process for medications that don't actually work. So pharmaceutical companies will argue that is a justification for the high cost of medications. Other people will argue that that actually isn't justified, and there's a big conversation and controversy going on nationally about the appropriateness of different types of medication prices. And a way of thinking about this is the fact that in other countries, medication prices tend to be substantially lower than in the United States. So there is a lot of conversation to be had there. So why do many drugs fail? This is actually an important consideration to understand this process of narrowing down medication. So a lot of the medications fail because of things like adverse drug reactions, or it might just be too costly to manufacture. Another factor is, can you get enough into the body to actually have a therapeutic effect? You also might just generally not be effective enough, or there might be patent type issues. It also might not be sufficiently selective in terms of what the biological process that it targets. You could have side effects. We could find that it's not shelf stable over time, so it breaks down over time. Actually, many medications that actually reach a market are actually good for quite a while, which is a real benefit, although there's some that expire really fast. Competition from other companies, for example, or it might be impractical to make for various logistical reasons. And you also want to actually be confident that the rationale for doing this, that's supporting this being used in health practice, is actually solid. So there's a lot of different reasons why, as we go through this process, a lot of these medications fail. Now, what's really interesting is this is actually changing. A lot of these fail because of adverse reactions or not having the right amount in the blood, and a lot of the cause of this is actually genetic. So there's a whole new field of pharmacogenomics where understanding the genetic factors of individual might mean that we can target certain drugs to some people who might not have adverse reactions and prevent people who might have adverse reactions from getting them. So a lot of these medications that failed going through the different phases of approval might actually be really helpful to a lot of people. So this is a really promising idea, and we might actually be able to minimize those adverse reactions. So there's a lot of excitement about those things currently. And a really great use of genetic testing technologies, potentially. All right. So when you get approved for a medication, there's some interesting things that you find. So once a drug is approved, it can actually be advertised to the public and marketed for the health-related effect that it was actually studied. All right. Now, if you have a drug that's approved, found to be safe, it's generally seen as appropriate for a clinician to give it do what's called off-label prescribing. So giving it to people for other types of health conditions. So this is actually really quite common. So they'll find in research sometimes that a drug that was approved for a certain condition is actually possibly useful for another health condition. And what sometimes they'll do is they'll just continue reapproving that drug to maintain a patent over time for different health conditions that it could be beneficial for. So this off-label prescribing is actually pretty common. There's also been an expansion in terms of what the FDA can do in terms of guarding drug safety. So thinking about making sure that people who are in these trials are actually representative of the general public, that we aren't talking about only high-income folks or people from a certain ethnic or racial background, so that the use of drugs actually is the research supporting the use of drugs is actually applicable to the people who actually use those drugs. They can also require follow-up studies, the phase 4 studies, to make sure that it's being helpful. They also are trying to create better database systems so that we can monitor these drugs over time and look for adverse effects through electronic medical records. Also, they have different regulations for who can prescribe different types of drugs based upon what their qualifications are, and also what criteria you need to look at to see whether or not it's appropriate to actually provide that drug. They were also allowed to approve and monitor the advertising that's done for to clinicians and patients. So there's a huge amount of money spent on promoting drugs. So direct-to-consumer advertisement of medications is a huge sort of ethical issue, because they're pushing people to get drugs, more medications, and the hope is that the patients will then try and get their clinician to buy it more, so that these companies can make more money. And so there's some real questions about the benefits and risk in that. On one side, you could argue that they could potentially get the benefit of a drug that they wouldn't have known about otherwise. On the other side, you could argue that it's actually leading to overuse of these medications. And of course, they can withdraw drugs from the market if there seems to be concerns raised about safety. So the FDA is also involved in the regulation of vaccines. This actually looks fairly similar to how we regulate drugs. However, the difference for vaccines is that vaccines go through when you test a vaccine, you often have to look at a very large number of people in order to see whether or not they're effective, right? Because some of these conditions are actually not very common. Infectious diseases are not very common. So if you're looking at a vaccine for measles, for example, you might have to look at hundreds of thousands of people to see enough people to actually know that the vaccine has enough of an impact to think that that's has benefit, right? So it is something that is monitored. There's also a reporting system to look and ensure safety of these vaccines over time. So there are systems in place for looking at this. Again, a very controversial area. Dietary supplements is also quite interesting. Dietary supplements are actually a very large industry. They're about $20 billion per year industry. So these are different substances like vitamins or other types of supplements of various sorts, herbal supplements that they don't fall under regulations of medications. So companies become actually responsible for ensuring that their safety. They don't have to go through any sort of evidence-based process to show safety and efficacy. So really, they're kind of a grab bag. There are quite a few supplements out there that are sold quite frequently where there's actually some concerns that they might have negative health effects for a wide range of different folks. The contents of these supplements are also not regulated, so you don't always know what you're getting. They've done a lot of research of these supplements to actually find that some of them may not even contain any of the contents of what they're supposed to be, or just minuscule amounts of it. So in terms of quality and dose, you have almost no idea for these supplements. So they're really a grab bag, and there's a lot of conversation about the appropriateness of this. So there are a range of other products that the FDA is in charge of looking at, things like cosmetics and cosmetic safety. There's a lot of different chemicals that go into cosmetics, and it's going right on your skin. So these can have real health effects. Medical devices. Different medical devices that we use have a range of different health impacts, and we want to make sure that each of them is appropriate and doesn't actually cause various different types of harm. Then biological products like blood supply, they're in charge of blood supply, making sure that's safe, looking at things like distribution, and tobacco products, where the FDA has recently started doing more work around tobacco products and appropriateness there. For example, looking at things like the nicotine level of cigarettes. So there's a lot of engineering and breeding of tobacco to make it more addictive, and the FDA has tried to sort of cut down on the addictiveness of tobacco. So that's food and drug safety in a nutshell. When we think about the amount of food that we all use food all the time, and it is something that foodborne illnesses is something that affect a lot of us over the course of a year, right? So 1 out of 6 people have a foodborne illness. It's a major consideration that we think about in terms of overall food systems and the safety of those systems. That's a major public health issue to be thinking about. And then drugs and medications, again, really commonly used, really very important for a lot of people. Drugs and medications are often viewed in a negative light, but we need to remember that a lot of people rely on them for solving health problems and sometimes staying alive. So having medications that are effective and safe for them is tremendously important. So a lot of things to think about here, and a lot of things to think about at a population and public health level. All right, so thank you very much for listening, and take care, everyone.